The Chronicles of The Plus One Infection, a podcast and novel by Kevin C. Norris. Chapter 2, The Room of Interrogation, in which our protagonist is pushed to the very limits of endurance by the stupid questioning of unseen officials.
Got a hard-on in my fist. Don't be pissed. Re-enlist Snap 2, Slow Throb. Jackson, I don't give a fuck, just give me my ruptured duck. Snap 2, Slow Throb. No one here can love or comprehend me, they just look for someplace else to send me. Tap my head and mic my brain, stick that needle in my vein, Slow Throb, Snap 2. Thomas Pynchon. Gravity's Rainbow.
Well, that was exciting, wasn't it? Just a rip-roaring adventure that ends on an exhilarating cliffhanger, right? You're completely lost, right? Well, you're going to need some background if we're going to keep moving forward, so settle in. Don't give me that shit. Look, maybe you care, maybe you don't. Maybe you just want to know what the fuck just happened out there. Maybe you think this is an interrogation where you're in charge and I'm going to give it all up. I can promise you it is not. You're going to get what you want, and more than what you bargained for besides, but it ain't going to be because you put the hoodoo on me with your amazing skills at good cop, bad cop. Forget that shit right now. I'm going to tell you because I want to tell you. It's that simple. So sit back and relax. What do you want to know? How it all started? Shit, I don't know. Shit, I don't know how it all started. I don't even know if started is the right way to describe it. I know there was a world where I felt like mostly the worst thing in it, and then suddenly I had a lot of competition. You low-level types, you don't even get a quarter of what's actually going on. I mean, sure, you see the obvious shit that happens on TV, same as everybody else. The sinkholes and the earthquakes, that fucking mountain that shot up under St. Paul's started spewing ash everywhere. Yeah, it looks bad, but that ain't even barely scratching the surface. And I'm not supposed to be telling you this stuff because you're not on a need to know. But after everything that just went down, I kind of want to. You know, I kind of just want to get it all off my chest. And since you're being so nice and quiet and letting me talk, and since you brought me in that whiskey I asked for, you sure no cigarettes? No, I understand. It's a government building. And since I'm feeling all sorts of weird feelings right now that are about as close to what you might call, remorse as I ever have, I'm going to go against my instincts and not use this fucking wire I just snaked out from under my left big thigh muscle to take both of your heads off and be on my merry way. See? I put it on the table. Yeah, you take that, honey. Put it in evidence or whatever. Since I'm not going to do that, I'm going to do something even worse. I'm going to tell you a story and tear your happy little worldview to pieces. And when I'm done, you're going to wish I did use that piano wire. Subchapter 2. All right, where to begin? I mean, obviously you can't be alive these days without at least knowing that something's been going on. Aside from the aforementioned geological anomalies, most people in the major and metropolitan centers of the West Coast at least have the sense not to go out at night without good reason, and I'm sure there are those curious souls who wonder about the giant mist wolf that winds through Griffith Park on some nights. But what's really kept the world sane, for the most part, and that's being super generous, is humanity's inability to really sit down and compare notes with itself if it doesn't have to. For example, let's say you're Joe Nobody, and you're out one night taking your Shih Tzu Mitzi to spray turds all over your neighbor's lawn. And let's say as you're checking your phone or whatever, something that looks suspiciously like a bat-winged hell monkey yanks poor old Mitz off her leash and takes off into the darkness, leaving nothing but a cooling puddle of doggy diarrhea as a reminder of said beloved pet. Now, Joe Nobody knows what he saw. He knows it wasn't an owl or a vulture or anything sensible like that. He knows this. But here's the problem. He can't believe it. Not in the sense of, I can't believe that just happened, but in the sense that he literally is unable to. He has to believe his own eyes are telling him lies rather than accept that the world has changed this much, no matter how much evidence there is to the contrary. And he certainly isn't going to go to his neighbor and tell him about the demon who took off with his dog, because that'd be crazy, right? It's been going on for a while, but most everybody seems to just be going on with their lives and not worrying over much about it. The people who get unlucky in the more, let's say for the sake of argument, paranormally active areas are just kind of whisked away like Mitzi, and nobody says nothing to nobody. Families mourn the loss but don't know exactly what it is they're mourning. It's kind of a war of attrition against reality. Good thing there are so many of us willing to pass the buck. That's why everybody gets so uptight when something happens to somebody important. Or somebody important to somebody important. Somebody it's not easy to just forget about. It's like this senator's kid, this chick. Yeah, Diana. She was important to somebody who was important, and so that's why the senator was given a little more information about what goes bump in the night, and then I was brought in to hopefully solve the problem without too much noise. Since you two aren't important to anybody, you don't usually get to talk to somebody like me. But here we are, and I feel like talking. So, let me tell you a story about how we got where we are. Subchapter 3. From what I understand, the real problem started when Adolf Hitler took over as the King of Hell. Okay. You thought that was just a joke or like a metaphor. Yeah, no, it's just about as literal as anything gets these days. I mean, pretty much everybody knew about how crazy old Adolf was for occult artifacts. He sent his intrepid tomb robbers he called Anunnurbi all over the planet searching for different religious relics like saints' finger joints or blood in a jar that hadn't coagulated after 300 years or whatever. But he went even further back too, like to the Egyptians and the Sumerians and even the Atlanteans. Yeah, I know. It's a lot to take in. And the Allies and their guys all over the place were trying to stop them. Things were kind of hairy there for a while in the occult black market with a lot of so-called archaeologists who were really just glorified tomb robbers. It was all pretty ridiculous, but I bet it would have made a hell of a good movies, or like a trilogy of movies maybe. So what did he want all this stuff for? Well, Adolf, it turns out, was a true believer. Seems he fell into some pretty legit groups back during the First Great War, met up with guys like Aleister Crowley, who's got his own fingers in a bunch of magical pies, I can tell you, and the Golden Dawn and all that Teutonic nationalist bullshit that Himmler introduced him to. But he saw firsthand what a little magic could do on the battlefield. Crowley had this trick where he could control clouds of mustard gas like he was conducting an orchestra. It was something to see, or so I'm told. It was a little before my time. After the war, Adolf slumped back home with nothing but a failed art career, a chip on his shoulder against pretty much everybody, and a fairly in-depth knowledge of the occult arts. Nothing too good. He was never any great shakes as a magician himself, but he got to know some powerful magicians he charmed with the good old Hitler charisma, and he got really excited about making some major changes in the world, which is more or less how the whole shitstorm that was the late 30s, early 40s political landscape came about. And then, hey, what is the matter with you two? I'm giving you the whole enchilada here. I'm telling you what's happening, why it's happening, what we're all doing here. Seriously, at least give me the fucking courtesy of listening to what I have to say. Lady, you're not even writing this shit down. You're just drawing dicks. Yeah, yes you are. I can see. You've drawn it's like a dozen dicks there. Man, oh man, why do I bother? This is why I keep asking myself, why do I even bother with any of you cud-chewing, glossy-eyed fucks? What? Am I done? Yeah, fine. Are you listening now? I've got some more to tell you before I get back to the main narrative. That all right? Christ. Are you sure you don't have any cigarettes? Subchapter 4. Near the end of the war, old Adolf did not like the look of where things were going, so he started to up the ante. Kind of like a Hail Mary football pass kind of thing. While in America they were busy turning sand to glass with the Manhattan Project, the much-venerated Book of Thoth turned out to be a dud. Nothing in there but incantations about harvest and baby-making. He found a pretty powerful relic of Kali, but it turned out to be such a drain on human resources that it wasn't worth it. Actually, most of those artifacts were a hell of a lot more trouble than they were worth in the long run. Except for just one of them. And in the end, save us all, Adolf managed to toss enough fishhooks into the world until he just about by dumb luck dredged himself up a really big thing. Like the biggest of all. Don't ask me why it's the most important or the most powerful. Obviously there's a hierarchy that makes sense to somebody. But after sending squad after squad of soldiers into a small temple in the Himalayas and watches as their pulped, broken, and slashed bodies piled up inside, he was eventually able to send a particularly nimble and fearless 13-year-old Nazi youth trumpeter inside to fetch this really big thing. And wonder of wonders, the kid managed to put his hands on it. The boy stumbled out of the cave looking like he'd been through the ringer, and he fell to one knee and presented it to Adolf, who had insisted he be plane walked into the staging area to take the thing himself, despite all of Himmler's sweaty assurances. The old man tousled the boy hair and said, "Danke, mein guter Sohn," and that was that. Hitler on that day got himself the Spear of Destiny. Oh, you say, oh, what is this Spear of Destiny, sir, of which you speak? And to that I say, oh, beats me. I know about as much as anybody, and aside from its questionable origins, it's a big mystery. All I can tell you is that, according to my sources, many of whom are quite credible, the spear is powerful, dangerous, and just about the last thing you wanted Adolf Hitler to be holding in his strudel-loving little hands. Fortunately, or unfortunately, it's really hard to tell sometimes, for us, the spear wasn't launched against the Allies, and the war pretty much went down the way it says in the history books, aside from the odd magical skirmishes on the French countryside after D-Day. Instead, old Adolf had himself a bigger prize in mind. See, what happened at the end of the war in that bunker in Berlin was not as it seemed. It was a carefully orchestrated cover-up to hide the fact that the entire final days narrative of Hitler's life is false, and kind of insulting when you think about it. I mean, the guy was nothing if not overconfident. Suicide would have been an option in his mind for lesser men. I have tasted the sweetness of a life of success. Who am I not to accept the bitter ashes of defeat, eh? I remember somebody telling me, he said, with a broad wink and a smile. Because Adolf wasn't going to commit suicide. He lost the war in Europe, but he'd made a contingency plan for an even greater conquest. All he had to do was get the ritual right. I can tell you almost exactly how it went down there in that bunker in Berlin in the final days, because all this shit is the same anywhere you go. There was Adolf in his robes, looking all solemn and chanting like an idiot with his droopy chin all flapping around. If you ever meet the guy in person, you'd know that the early mid-century photography was very kind. He did not have a pleasant face to look at up close. I mean, or so I'm told. But anyway, he'd be there, and Bormann would be there all sweaty in his robes, and fucking fish-faced Goebbels only mouthing the words with his fucking fish mouth. I don't know why, but there's always one guy who just fucking mouths the words, like that's gonna get them off the hook or anything. And they'd be all chanting, yada yada yada, and out comes Ava in chains, very blonde and screaming like there was no way she had signed up for this. "Oh, Dorothy, baby, I knew you said there were going to be rough times, but I didn't know about the gang rape and ritual murder." So yeah, a bunch of pale, pocked, sweaty, smelly German guys all pile on the blonde, and Adolf strangles her, and then cuts off her arms and legs and mutilates her face, and it's ritual, 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 and portal to hell. Well, how do you like that? Crowley was right all along, even though he never got there himself. He must have, forgotten to cross a T or gouge out an I. One more for that good old German efficiency. I cannot imagine what he must have been thinking at that point, as he crossed through to the hell dimension, the Russian shells just fading in the distance as the screams and wailings of the damned got louder and louder. But as far as I've heard in certain circles, Lucifer was not pleased at all. I mean, he no doubt applauded the guy's enthusiasm, and I mean, the numbers speak for themselves, but Satan, in the end, is a businessman like any other, and he doesn't like it when some kid who hasn't even had an internship comes waltzing in like he owns the place. But because he's a businessman and he just does what businessmen do, he doesn't cause a fuss. He doesn't scream and curse and start terminating staff. He does what any businessman does when he meets a potential new, vice president of flaying with salt knives? Something like that, probably. Lucifer walks up to Hitler with a great big smile on his face and sticks out his hand. And do you know what that ballsy fucker Hitler does then? He puts out one hand to shake, and with the other comes out the Spear of Destiny from under his robe, and with his spindly little Hitler arms, he puts that fucking relic right through old Lucifer Morningstar's eye. Wham! Out the back of his head. It was a mess, I heard. Imagine that. One of the perfect fallen angels, one of the original heavenly hosts, snuffed by an egomaniac with a cowlick and a shit mustache. I mean, Politically, he was a ding-dong, but man, the balls on him. You gotta respect that. Subchapter 5. So that was that. Hitler was the ruler of the Hell Dimension and pretty much got everything that he wanted from that point on. It's all been this long ride we've taken with the guy behind the scenes keeping the world unstable. Because Hitler, for all his Germanness, let's call it, was not nearly the leader that Lucifer had been. I mean, after all, the guy did just invade Russia in the middle of winter. Sure, when the big L was in charge, it was all evil and suffering and all that, but the trains ran on time, as they say. Everybody knew what they were supposed to do, and Lucifer ran a pretty tight ship. But pretty much as soon as Adolf took over, things started to slip. Like at first, everyone sort of just did their job the way they always had, which was basically to do all sorts of rotten things to the tortured souls that they were in charge of. And that went on for a while, but eventually there was some low talk and some rumblings about hell not being the place it used to be. And when that happens, you have to understand that these are not exactly employees of the month to begin with. We're talking 6 or 7 levels worth of demonic inbreeding here. These are not nice guys, and certainly they're not going to do what some shrimp with a dopey mustache has to say just because they believe in the future of evil. No, Hitler had his work cut out for him, that's for damn sure, and he was not a very good manager right from the get-go. Nobody wanted to take orders. Goebbels and Bormann would just sit around like fat cats eating strudel and poking babies with little pitchforks. It was a disgusting scene, I can tell you. So I heard. And anybody who knows anything about the nature of the multidimensional universe knows that that kind of thing can't last forever. There's a certain amount of balance that's needed to maintain all these different dimensions, and Hitler and his pals were messing it up for everybody. And that, my dear friends, is why, on June 27th, 1947, everything in our cozy little corner of the universe started to change for the weirder. Subchapter 6. When Kenneth Arnold looked out the window of his little puddle jumper on that midsummer day, what he thought he saw, and what a lot of people thought he saw, were the first sightings of an invasion from another world. And while they were right, technically, it wasn't green-skinned Martians he was seeing that day, but the early signs of what was to become an ever-worsening breach between our universe and the splinter dimensions that extend almost to infinity. It's actually a Mobius bend in 5-dimensional space, but that's not really important. From our universe, the inceptive dimension. The inceptive thing is not really that important either. We're no more or less than any of the other dimensions, really. It's just that we were where everything started from moving outward, and I guess it does influence how the splinters turned out and vice versa. Again, it's complicated. I don't really want to get into it because we're talking about what happened here and why things are the way they are. Anyway, Arnold saw bright cylindrical objects that moved through the sky like, quote, saucers skipping on a lake. And that's where we got the whole, well, you know. But he didn't see what he thought he saw. What he actually saw were celestial seahorses from the 145th plane that had broken through and were just hopping joyously through our atmosphere, which reacted with their chemical makeup to make them glow. Unfortunately, it also caused them to disintegrate into gas a few minutes later. Little did they know that their fun joyride suicide run would cause such a stir. The war was over and everybody was all amped up and full of piss and vinegar, and we really needed a new thing to keep that part of our brain that needs to be worried about something occupied. For most people it was the Russians, of course, but for a lot of people, what they wanted was what they didn't want and were most scared of. They were convinced that something we didn't understand was going to show up and make the human race irrelevant. Of course, it wasn't long before more sightings of crazy shit started happening and more people started wondering just what was going on. So, slowly but surely, the people at the top started covering things up, giving alternate explanations, happily letting the public go on with this whole flying saucer craze because the truth was a whole hell of a lot scarier. The fact of the thing was that there were little holes in reality opening up in random places all across the globe, and more weird shit was happening. Through the 50s and 60s, the big picture was still small enough to not have to do much to keep average Joe and Jane America being fat and ignorant. The war was over. The economy was off the charts. Nobody wanted to hear anything except how great we all were and how we were going to run the planet forever. But like with anything else of this nature, things got too big and started to go a little south. Like when Kennedy took a look at all the big secrets and decided that maybe the human race was ready to deal with this stuff head on. Well, that didn't last long, let me tell you. You want to talk about a magic bullet theory? Well, it's no theory, you dig. It was literally a magic bullet. I know the warlock would put the glam on it. Lee Harvey didn't exactly act alone, but he was also right when he said he was a patsy. You know how he was shot before he was even allowed to testify? Well, that's because he'd have a crazy story to tell about a Louisiana voodoo shaman and why there was about 3 quarts of Harlequin's coral snake venom in his stomach at the time of his arrest. It's a bit complicated, but not nearly so complicated as the conspiracy nutjobs wanted to believe, so it was alright. Let them think it was the mob or Cuba or whatever, when really it was a consortium of lower-level demons who had a good thing going and didn't want the truth out. And so Kennedy's head got splattered and people looked in the wrong direction. As a pretty good writer once said over and over, so it goes. Subchapter 7. After that, it was kind of just downhill. Everybody started to get more and more miserable as the barriers between dimensions got thinner and thinner. Two-bit goons from any number of the upper or lower planes started infiltrating everything. Your neighbor could be one. Your grandma could have a cosmic mind worm glowing in her guts. Your dog could be a fucking interdimensional super genius just biding his time shitting on the lawn and yapping his little head off. People started to get really paranoid, and for good reason. I think the big moment came when a literal parademon from the hell dimension was elected president of the United States. Sure, there had been other world leaders that had ties to the underworld. Fucking Ike almost sold them the whole kit and caboodle back in the 50s before some DOD guys got in there and capped him. Fortunately, an Eisenhower robot replacement doesn't have to be all that dynamic. But this was the first time a full-blown denizen of the lower planes held the highest office of the most powerful nation on Earth. And this was the turning point for the U.S., when suddenly it was no longer an obvious thing to trust the government, because most people knew something was really wrong, even if they didn't exactly know what it was. And when those two reporters stumbled onto the truth, they didn't have much more than a few interesting leads before they were sent off on a wild goose chase. That's the brilliance of all this. It's just giving people enough truth so they can go off on their own. So Woodward and Bernstein got their Pulitzer and utterly failed to expose the biggest story of the 20th century. I think where they finally tipped their hand a little too much was with the moon landing. I mean, it was just ridiculous. Hey, let's show how great we Americans are. We're going to go to the moon. I mean, we didn't go to the moon, of course. By that point, they had enough major enchanters in high office that we could have shown these astronauts landing on Pluto if we wanted to. And anyway, if we had gone to the moon, we wouldn't have liked what we have found up there. It was a pretty big staging ground for a lot of the illegal mining operations that go on in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. They were originally going to put it on series, but, well, you don't care about that. The point is, we got our moon landing, and for a little bit, it almost seemed like America at least was going to start believing in itself again. But too much damage had been done. Just because the evil at the top doesn't look like a fucking chupacabra doesn't mean that it wasn't sucking ghosts behind the scenes, and people knew something was going on. What were they going to do? Well, the 70s were a rough time all over the world, and it kept looking like there were going to be some kind of revolution that was going to blow the lid off everything. But it kept just kind of getting to the brink, and somehow it would all cool down again, and people would go back to their color televisions and their nightly six-packs and forget that there was all kind of nastiness hiding just outside their field of vision. You think disco was an accident? Cocaine? Watch? The Beatles breaking up? Pocket calculators? The Cambodian genocide? Atari? The Jonestown thing? I mean, it goes on and on. It was a titanic struggle between the turning tide of history and just making everyone say, oh look, fucking Space Invaders on my TV set. And it would have gone on like that too if those smart fuckers trying to keep our minds off how terrible shit was getting hadn't figured out how to put the whammy on us in a big way. Old Ronald Reagan was perfect. Movie star looks, charm, Mr. Aw Shucks American, who you really felt like you could trust. You see, the mistake they made with Nixon was that he looked half about as evil as he was. At the time, they didn't really worry about that because they figured everybody would just go with what the president said no matter what. But when that didn't work out for them so well, they had to figure out something different. And that, my friends, was finding a face for evil that was so nice, so darned lovable, that you just had to believe that he was on your side. And the American people fell for it. This started the decades where they felt more and more like they didn't have to worry about anything, that it'll all be taken care of. Everybody can just watch TV and go to the movies and play video games and it'll all be fine. And that's why when something like Old Town happened, it was barely a blip on anybody's radar. People just kind of ignored it and went on listening to their stereo Walkman. Yeah, man, did you hear about that thing? No, I hear it was a sinkhole. Yeah, so my cousin was there and he said it was a construction accident. Wow, cool. Did you hear about who the Broncos got in their first draft pick? As long as it wasn't happening right in front of their faces, and well, sometimes when it was, they could safely keep going on with their little lives, consuming and pretending the shit they were doing was important. And anybody who tried to complicate the world by waking people up to it became a conspiracy whack job or a terrorist. I don't really have to go on, do I? Old Adolf is sitting down there in hell, wearing as heavy a crown upon his head as any truly deserving tyrant does. Shit goes bonkers in most of the major cities, and sometimes down the street from your uncle in Jehoshaphat, Idaho. I mean, this is enough backstory to fill you in, right? There's a long way to go, and suffice it to say, I've given you way more than I probably should have. It's okay, though. You seem like trustworthy types. Subchapter 8. Where was I during all this? You want to know about me now? Well, alright. I'll tell you. Why not? I basically wandered around for a while after the war, not really knowing what to do with myself. I wasn't hurting for money because my father had made sure there was plenty before he crossed over. Died. I mean, crossed over from life to death. Whatever. But money wasn't really what I was interested in, and after Poland, I decided that I needed to go somewhere more, fast-paced. Nothing that was happening in Eastern Europe at that time particularly interested me. So America or bust for me. I made my way across the continent, causing a little bit of havoc wherever I could just to keep my enthusiasm up, but it wasn't really worth it. Everybody was already too tired and used to the horror of a war that ran roughshod all over their lives to care about a lesser boogeyman like me. So in the end, as I moved across the continent, I actually ended up helping people more than scaring the fuck out of them. I was like taking care of some of the shit that was happening, a werewolf here, a druidic swamp witch there. It was at least interesting, and it kept the populace from eating themselves out of sheer terror. Alright, but I'm rambling now. I promise I just have a little bit more to go before I get back to what happened after I fell through the portal. I know you guys have so many more important things to do than listen to an abbreviated history of a world narrated by an asshole. So, I made it to Portugal, found myself a ship to stow away on, and by the end of 1949, I was on my way and ready to take on the amber waves of grain and purple mountains majesties of the grand old USA. And boy, was it ever not ready for me. Subchapter 9. I landed in New York on July 4th, 1949. It was quite a day. I didn't bother with the whole Ellis Island experience. After 4 days sitting in the hold of a steamship, I was busting at the seams to do something. I stole a lifeboat and rode my ass off until I found a nice quiet spot to step on to my new home. It was hot as hell, pushing 102 degrees, but I didn't care. I went to Coney Island, smiled at all the lovelies eating cotton candy and not even realizing how close they were to a real monster. Then I caught myself a baseball game. The Yankees beat the Red Sox in the second game of a doubleheader, if I recall correctly. Yeah. Ate a hot dog, jerked off in the public toilet, and figured where I'd go next. I knew a few people through my father's dealings. He never kept me out of anything, said I needed to understand the ways of the world. By the time I was 7 years old, I had seen things that would make most grown men sick. It certainly wasn't a treat for me, but I was just a little kid and I got used to it. Used it to make myself stronger. I already knew how to speak English. My father had forced it on me, along with a dozen other languages. But those months in 1940s New York was where I lost my accent and really turned into an American. The melting pot. Oh, how I love her. So I knew a few people in the New York area just by reputation more than anything else, but when you've got the right credentials, it'll get you very far down into the underworld. So for a while, I just had a blast, almost like a childhood I didn't have, experimenting with all sorts of new stuff that the American magicians that had been cooking up, things like spirit walking across the plains, shit my dad had only speculated about. This is where I found out most of what I know about the lower plains dimensions, just whizzing through all incorporeal and seeing what there was to see. A real fucking mind-opener that was, I have to say, and it really gave me a lot of perspective about what my place in everything was. You see, if I was going to make a name for myself, I'd have to do it slow and easy, work my way into the big time, play the long con, as it were. That was when I decided I needed to start seriously looking into protecting myself and making sure I didn't die before I could start making the splash. So I made my way down from New York through the South and eventually ended up where any good wielder of the darker arts ends up, which is, of course, Louisiana. You guys are smirking, but let me tell you something. Them voodoo broads have some pretty deep history, and it shows in their power. I mean, think about it. It goes back through the Caribbean and then to the Dark Continent where pretty much all of shamanism began. I met a woman who claimed to be Eve. Yeah, that Eve. And you know what? From the looks of her, I kind of believed it. She had wrinkles on her wrinkles, and not a tooth in her head, but her eyes had depths like I had never seen before or since. She ran a little gumbo stand outside of Baton Rouge with her sister. She seemed kind of wonked in the head to me, but I guess if you're eons old, that'll happen. They didn't end up having anything I could use to keep myself young and vital, but the gumbo was pretty good. It had those little mud crabs things in it, like little lobsters, real spicy. Like the spiciness would just build on your tongue until it almost hurt and then back off. I don't know how she did that. Yeah, that was pretty good gumbo. Maybe a little too much okra for my taste. Anyway, what was I saying? Eventually I got what I was looking for. It's a fairly complicated spell, but not earth-shattering or anything like that. And I was assured that the aging process was going to be slowed down tremendously. And I guess it worked, seeing as how I look pretty goddamn good for a fella pushing 90. Actually, now that I think about it, that whole story of how I managed to track down the warlock I was able to persuade to cast a spell on me is a real barn burner in itself. Had some long-lasting repercussions in the entire New Orleans underworld. But I can see your eyes glazing over again, so I'll save that for another time. So I got myself set for the long haul. Now I just needed to go to where the action was. I made my way up north, spent a little while in Cleveland, killing the odd townie who got a little mouthy about weirdos, then up through the Midwest, Wisconsin, where I stopped off at a farm one night and met a guy named Ed with a lot of the same interests as me. I dare say I helped him along by putting some interesting ideas in his head. Then it was down south again where I kind of hit my personal bottom, as they say in the meetings. I already talked about that. It was a real turning point for me, realizing that there was a more dangerous and interesting prey out there than just the sheep I'd been slaughtering at random. There were other predators out there, and I could be the top of the food chain. That's when I felt like I could really start making a difference. Eventually I made it to California, where I stayed for quite a while. There was just something about the place that had a kind of mystical draw for me. In much the same way as New York, LA and especially San Francisco had a weirdness to it in the 60s that really almost made me feel normal. I spent a lot of time just playing it straight, kind of enjoying the vibe. I wasn't a hippie, but I certainly felt the love or whatever. And before you ask, yeah, I knew Chuck Manson. He was a straight-up dipshit. And no, I did not have anything to do with that shit he pulled at that actress's place. I thought it was really low class the way he handled that. He's lucky the law got hold of him before I did, or I would have given him the same treatment I gave that Zodiac asshole. Things were going really well for me. I was feeling good, training and developing my skills, eating right. Maybe I was overdoing it a little on the drugs, but my body was pretty much protected from any kind of poisoning, and that included ODing on the massive amounts of shit I was putting into my body. Whatever, right? It felt good, and coming down just made me meaner. I was offing dimension jumpers with bad intentions left and right. Why? Because I'll tell you what, when you've done as much killing as I've done, there's no joy, really, in surprising another cow that's just standing in the field waiting for it. Also, it's a shitload less trouble taking on a jerk from the fear dimension with no paper trail than some schoolteacher in Sheboygan with a penchant for talking to strangers. So I was having the time of my life, fighting and fucking, and really I could just do no wrong. Until I got caught, and shit changed for real. Subchapter 10. It happened in all places in a little nowhere town about an hour from either LA or San Diego called Aliso Viejo. Just a really nothing little OC suburb with a couple of gas stations and strip malls, and not a whole lot else. It was really dull, but good for a guy like me who was trying to lay low after a short period of extreme bad luck. Also, there were a statistically large number of werewolves living there, surfers mostly, and the odd murder was kind of par for the course. What? No. It's not the place with the sparrows. Sparrows? No, you're thinking of Rancho Cucamonga, I think. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The important thing is that I was there. I'd rented a room, settled down to do some research into the idea that I had about, well, that's not important either. The truth is, I was just holding up so I could drink myself and smoke myself stupid for a few weeks, get truly fucked and ready to kill again. I was bored, really, and not knowing what to do with myself, I was going to get lit up like the 4th of July. Well, you know how you get so drunk that things you know aren't good for you are suddenly seeming like a great idea? Well, I got a call from a friend of mine who had a hot tip on a pack of werewolves who were going to be moving through one of the neighborhoods on the outskirts of town, probably on the lookout for some kid on his bike too late. They could rip him apart and blame it on coyotes or whatever. They love that shit. Sometimes go to the funeral, jerks. I usually have a pretty hands-off policy when it comes to things like that. If a werewolf or some other creature of the night wants to do what the creatures of the night do, who am I to tell them that they're wrong? I find it's really best to keep a live and let live, or unlive live, as the case may be, right? Whatever. Attitude about that sort of thing. It's usually only when things start getting out of hand that I get involved. The day-to-day nastiness is what it is. I'm not going to change that. But as I said, I was drunk and pretty tweaked, and even worse than that, I was bored out of my mind with books and fucking small potato magical experiments. I told my buddy I'd meet him out there and we'd, I don't know, bust up some werewolves. Let the fur fly? Look, I said it wasn't a good plan, okay? Turns out, it wasn't just not a good plan, it was a trap. And I walked into it. I don't know if my buddy had anything to do with it or not, but that is a conversation we might have if I ever run into him again. But I do know that when I got to the spot, there weren't any werewolves there, but there were about 6 dozen trained mercenaries with tranquilizer guns and tasers and all sorts of shit. I know I took down about 10 of the fuckers, so they finally got the best of me. When I came to, I was in this little room and they told me what the deal was. I was going to work for them. Them who? Doesn't matter. Some arm of the government that hasn't been infiltrated by the fiends of hell, maybe. I don't know. The good guys. I would be allowed to live and continue my research, but I would minimize the civilian casualties and help them neutralize the big baddies that were starting to show up at that time. I said, if I recall correctly, why the fuck not? And that, my friends, is how I ended up in all this mess. I don't know too many names, and the person who gives me assignments over the phone changes every few months, but I know that I get an all-black credit card that gives me unlimited expenses for all the takeout tikka masala I can shove in my face, the best booze and drugs, hotel rooms, and access to weapons and some tech that's a little under wraps at this point, with no questions asked. And all I have to do is every so often clobber some confused shub-niggeruff who wanders into the wrong dimension and start eating the hoi polloi indiscriminately. And that, as they say, is that. So let's get back to the story. So I think I'm just going to wing this. So that's the second chapter to the book, and it's basically an explanation of all the things that are going on and like how this universe has come together. It's not, I know it's kind of corny, but it works, I think, and it's going to be continuing on, and it's all going to be very locked in place for the rest of the books. So I had a lot of fun writing it. This kind of part can be a little tedious because you're trying to like connect all the real things that are happening to the imaginary things that are happening in your head. But since most of this shit is kind of like pretty close to what actually happened, I didn't really have that much of a big deal about it. So anyway, I enjoyed doing it. I enjoyed reading it. I hope you enjoyed listening to it. I enjoyed putting the sound effects in it. Freesound.org is like the best place ever. You can go in there and just say, do a search, and you will find whatever you need. It's kind of amazing. And I don't know. I'm just really enjoying this whole thing, and thanks to everybody who was involved with this one. That would be me, I guess. My mom for listening to it and making sure that everything was okay. Thanks, Ma. And I don't know. Get the book, buy the book, read the book. The sequel's going to be coming out soon. I'm writing it right now. The Something of Nothing. But read the book, listen to the podcast, do everything. I just really want. This is like a dream come true for me. Just being able to do all this stuff. So anyway, I love you guys, and I'll see you in the funny papers.